Hey there, it's another time for another science lesson. We'll be continuing with our lesson on ecology, and this time we'll be looking at ecological management, associations, and tolerance. Now, at the end of these lessons, learners should be able to describe terms like association, tolerance, geographical range, competition, and predation. Learners should be able to state and describe the various types of associations between organisms in the same habitat, giving examples. And finally, learners should be able to explain the geographical distribution of organisms due to ecological factors. Now, moving along, we'll be looking at the term associations. Now, what are associations? Now, before we define that, biodiversity creates interaction, which in turn creates relationships between organisms living in the same environment. Now, associations or relationships exist among organisms in the same environment, which includes symbiosis, predator-prey relationships, competition, and mutualism. Moving along, we'll be looking at the term symbiosis. What is symbiosis? It's the kind of relationship between two different species of organisms in which one or both benefit from the relationship. Now, as you can see from the picture that we have here, we have the various types of symbiosis as is being pointed to. We have mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So we'll be looking at those relationships one after the other. Now, going along, we are looking first at mutualism. What is mutualism? This is a type of symbiotic relationship in which both organisms benefit from the relationship. Now, we have various examples that you see here. You have humans and gut bacteria. We have bees and flowers. Now, the bees help to pollinate the flowers, while the flower provides nectar for the bees for food. Now, you have ants and aphids, lichen, which is the relationship between fungi and algae. We have the woolly bat and pitcher plant. Now, the gut bacteria here, as you see in the intestine of man, helps to break down certain materials, and in the process the bacteria is also fed. So it's a win-win situation. It's a mutualistic relationship. Now, we have the clownfish and sea anemone. So all these relationships requires that two of them benefit from the relationship, and none is harmed, but two of them benefit mutually from the relationship. Along, we'll be looking at parasitism. Now, parasitism is a type of symbiotic relationship in which one organism benefits, and the organism that benefits is called a parasite, while the other one is harmed or suffers, usually the host. Now, we have various examples of parasitic relationships here. We have the tick and the dog. Now, the tick is on the skin of the dog, is an ectoparasite. It derives nourishment from the dog while the dog is uncomfortable. Now, we have hookworms in humans. The hookworm is inside the human. It's called the endoparasite because it's found inside the human. What it does is that it feeds off the nutrients in the body while the humans are harmed in the process. Now, we have leeches and humans. Now, the leech is an ectoparasite that sucks nourishment from the skin of human beings. It's an ectoparasite, while the human being is harmed in the process. We have the cuckoo in other bird nests that feeds off even the food that the birds are supposed to have. Now, we have the whales and the barnacles. Now, all these points to a parasitic relationship. Now, moving along, we have another relationship called the commensalism. Now, commensalism is a type of symbiotic relationship in which one organism benefits without harming the other. Now, we have the cattle egret, which eats insects, on the livestock here, especially the cow that we see here. Yes. Now, the egret benefits without causing harm to the cow. Now, we also have epiphytes that grow on large trees. Now, these epiphytes are plants that grow on large trees. Now, what they do is that they are able to get nutrients from the atmosphere while on the large plant, while the large plant neither benefits or is harmed in the process. So the large plant helps the epiphyte to get sunlight and other nutrients from the environment without harming the large plant. Now what we have here is bed trail army ants to eat fleeing what? Insects. So you see, here the plant is neither harmed, neither is the ant harmed, while the bird benefits from the particular insect on the trail of the army ants. Now moving along, we're going to go into another kind of association seen even in the habitat, which is competition. Now in this association, two organisms fight or struggle for available resources like food, light, space, or mate. Now we have examples, which are the male lizards fighting over a female for mate. Now shoots of plants bending towards light when they are shielded by bigger trees. Now as you can see in the picture here, you can see two male lions here fighting over the territory or space. Now the last association that we'll be looking at here is predation. Now predation is an association between two organisms, the predator and the prey, in which one kills the other for food, and it's usually the predator that kills the prey for food. Now examples that we have is the lion and the zebra, and as you can see in the picture here, you can see that the lion here is the predator while the zebra is the prey. Now another example of predation is the eagle and fish. Now it is the eagle that kills the fish for food. The eagle here is the predator while the fish here is the prey. Another part of ecological management is tolerance. Now we're going to be looking at the concept tolerance. Now you must understand that the environment does not remain static. Changes are always occurring in the environment. The conditions, especially the abiotic conditions or abiotic factors, don't always remain the same. They are constantly changing. And that is why we are looking at the concept of tolerance, because it describes an organism's capacity to survive variation or changes in the environmental conditions, such as the soil pH, temperature, pressure, light. Now because of these changes, it can produce unfavorable conditions for the living organism that live in a particular habitat. Now, an organism's tolerance to a given factor will influence its geographical distribution. In other words, species can only be found in places where maximum and minimum limits are within its tolerance range. For instance, when we look at the issue of temperature, sometimes some organisms, they prefer the hot temperature, some organisms prefer the cold temperature, some organisms can tolerate hot temperature, while some living organisms can tolerate cold temperatures. Now this will determine where these organisms can be found, and each organism has their own maximum and minimum. Look at these limits as an example. Now let's look at the concept of tolerance range. Now tolerance range refers to the maximum and minimum limit to which an organism can bear or withstand. Now as you can see in this picture here, we are looking at butterflies as the organism in question. Now we have the optimum range with which the butterfly can survive and carry out its activity even to the fullest, and can function properly, which is called the niche. Now that in our first lesson we talked about this concept niche, which talks about the place and the function or the work of any living organism in a particular habitat. So we are looking at the butterfly as an example here. Now within this optimum range, it can function perfectly. It can function perfectly and do carry out its work. But if you go beyond the optimum range, we have the zone of physiological stress. Now within this range, you have the butterfly going through some certain stress, and that's why you don't have many organisms. As you can see here in the graph, you don't see many of them within this range, though there are still some that will function within this zone of physiological stress, either to the left or to the right here. So from the zone of physiological stress and the optimum range forms this butterfly's tolerance range, and beyond this it cannot survive. Beyond this range, it cannot survive. And that is why beyond this tolerance range, you have the zone of intolerance. You have the zone of intolerance to the left and to the right. Now, looking at the temperature here, in this zone of intolerance, you have too cold and you have too hot. That is, if you are focusing on the temperature here as the abiotic factor that we are considering. Beyond this zone of physiological stress, we have the intolerance zone. And in this zone, no organism can be found there. In other words, any organism that goes beyond the zone of physiological stress can only do one of three things. They can either leave the habitat, die, or adapt when they get to the zone of physiological stress. But anything beyond that, they will die off. And this explains the tolerance range of living organism, using butterfly here as an example and temperature as the abiotic factor that we are considering. This concludes our lesson for today. Now, as a summary, you can see the associations describe the relationship between organisms in the same habitat. These relationships include mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, predation, and competition. Tolerance describes any organism's capacity to survive changes in the environmental condition, especially the abiotic factors. Tolerance range refers to the maximum and minimum limits to which an organism can bear or withstand. And lastly, species can only be found in places where maximum and minimum limits are within its tolerance range. Now, I want you to pause this video and go through this assessment and see how much of the lesson you've been able to understand or imbibe, and I'll see you again in the next lesson.